Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this Imotions Path to Publication webinar. My name is Kate Crochelle. I am one of the marketing managers here at Imotions, and we have these webinar series about our awesome clients who are working with Imotions to actually publish and get results with our software. So that is the topic of this webinar today, and I am so excited to have Anne Sussman here. I'm going to introduce her in a minute, but can wave and say hi. Okay, thanks Anne for joining. Before we begin, I just have some very quick housekeeping notes just so everyone is on board. We are recording this webinar, so anyone who is registered and is attending now, or even if you have registered with your email address but you need to leave early, or you have colleagues who have registered who can't be here today, they will receive the recording tomorrow in 24 hours. So even if you have to leave early, if you can only stay for half of the webinar, for example, that's no problem. You will get the full recording tomorrow, so you can see the full 45 minutes to an hour of what Anne is going to be telling us about. And then lastly, we are going to be running a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, you can see in your panel, you should be able to see a question box on the right side. So if you have questions for Anne throughout the presentation, please put them into the question box and we will queue them up so that she can answer them. We will have her presentation for about a half an hour, and then we'll move into a Q&A, maybe 40 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer. So on that note, yes, I wanted to introduce Anne Sussman, RA. Welcome. She is a published author, biometric researcher, architect, and lecturer. Her book, Cognitive Architecture, Designing for How We Respond to the Built Environment, co-authored with Justin B. Hollander, won the Place Research Award from the Environmental Design Research Association in 2016. And it is also the first book with more than 24 eye-tracking images of architecture in color. So that's kind of a cool stat that we like. And her new book, Urban Experience and Design, also co-authored with Hollander, was released last November in 2020. And she's currently teaching a course on perception and the human experience of place, architecture, and cognition at the Boston Architectural College. And last but not least, she is a longtime Imotions user, and we're excited to hear how she's worked with the software for her research. So welcome. We're so happy to have you here, Anne.
Thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, so we're gonna get to your presentation in a very quick minute, but I just wanted to give a little agenda overview. So we'll start with a little bit of an intro into what Imotions does for those of you who have not maybe heard of us, who haven't worked with our software before, and then we'll move right into Anne's presentation and then the audience Q&A. So without further ado, I will just introduce a little bit about Imotions. I don't want to go too much into it, but just to give you a background. We are a global company. We have been working with customers in biometric research and human behavior for over 16 years. We have our headquarters here in Copenhagen, that's where I'm based, but we also have a big office in Boston where Anne lives, and then also we are in Germany and Singapore and Australia. So we help many clients worldwide, both in the academic and the commercial space, conduct their human behavior research. But what does that actually mean? Simply put, we're a software solution that is able to integrate tons of biosensor data. So from eye tracking to skin conductance, which is a measure of sort of skin sweat on your hands and your skin. We also measure facial expressions, so you can detect emoted facial expressions and integrate all of those different signals, including electroencephalography, heart rate, respiration. We even have an external API that you can bring third-party data that is not integrated naturally with us, all into the same platform, visualize it, analyze it, export it, so that you can really understand what's going on at the sort of non-conscious level of human behavior and cognition. So, you know, if you are doing human behavior research, maybe you have heard about self-report, thinking about how you can ask people how they react to a certain situation or a stimulus, but there's so much more under the surface of how we actually react in our bodies that Imotions enables us to analyze and record. So we power academic and commercial labs. You can see some of them here. So if you are in any of these spaces, both on the academic side, you know, maybe you're in architecture as Anne is, but maybe you're also studying user experience, usability, psychology, performance and training, all of these different ways that we can measure the human experience, chances are Imotions can help. So on that note, I wanted to actually turn it over to Anne, and I'm going to give Anne presenter access now so that she can take over and tell us about her awesome research. All right, Anne, so you should have gotten my notification now, and you can start sharing your screen. Perfect. So we see your email, so we just want to get to the PowerPoint presentation.
What happens here? Let's see if I can see the PowerPoint. Oh, here we go. Can you see it?
Perfect. Mm-hmm.
Thank
Perfect.
you so much, Kate. This is so exciting. I'm so excited to be here. And this is blue sky, guys. It's very exciting to be here. So what I'm going to be talking about is a talk I've given about a couple dozen times now about designing for the subliminal brain, architecture in the 21st century paradigm shift. And what I'm really talking about is when you use tools like Imotions, you see yourself and architecture in a completely new way. What I'm talking about is actually been something someone said before. It's called the 21st century paradigm shift. This is a term that the OECD, the Organization for Economic Communication, Cooperation and Development, came up with in 2012. They said the 21st century is a new time, guys. It's the age of biology. They actually gave this PowerPoint. They let me use part of it. The 21st century is the age of biology, says Professor Anne Glover, who is a dame of the British Empire. That's a female knight. She's also a biologist. And what she explains is that the 19th century is the age of engineering. It gave us cameras, trains, bicycles, the Eiffel Tower. It gave us new ways of working and living in the world. It really changed. It changed how we built. It changed our lives. The 20th century, when I was born, is the age of chemistry and physics. We got the first plastics, radar. We split an atom, first computers, first credit cards, the age of chemistry and physics. My dad was a chemical engineer. It all makes sense. He made plastics. But now we're in a new time. It's the age of biology. And it is game changing. Not only can you do things like, decode the DNA, we've now figured out what human DNA is. We've analyzed it. You can run in a marathon without legs on blades. What we can do is we can understand better the cells that interact, that give us our life, and we can also understand how things happen in our world in new ways. We can kind of see things inside out. And so what was amazing to me in this new age of biology, I did contact Imotions, and I thought, well, we can really look at how people see architecture. And this was an early study, pilot study I did. I thought, let's take a really famous building like Palladio's Villa Rotunda. Thousands of buildings have been built like it. And nobody's ever eye-tracked it before. How do people actually look at it? Why is this building so famous? This building actually proved a model for the White House. And what you can do is when you do a quick 15-second eye-tracking study, you'll suddenly see what most of us have never seen before. These are the fixations and saccades. We can actually see how this woman is looking at the building, what catches her eye without her awareness, and where her fixations, where her eyes focus 45 times in 15 seconds. It's completely fascinating. It really changes how you see architecture. And what you see too is how, as your mom might have said to you, everyone looks at the world a little differently. You can see here how this person is looking a little differently at this famous building. And she doesn't know how she's doing it, but I do. I can start to follow it, right? It's quite fascinating. And then what you can do with Imotion software that's really powerful is you can start getting statistical analysis with this to really get down to the nitty gritty of how this building draws the eye. You usually have 30 to 39 people to look at an image on in the computer. In this case, this is what we did. And you get something really fascinating that advertisers and graphic designers are fascinated by. The time to first fixation, where people look first, second, third, fourth, fifth. And you can see, where they'll look first in the center of the building, where there was a graphic panel, where they look second at the door. But what's really fascinated me as an architect was how the statues drew the attention. And one could make the argument that if this building hadn't had so many statues, it couldn't be as famous. The statues are simply drawing the eye. And that's the amazing thing. This was the early setup we had. using Imotions software. And what you just saw, Imotions software, as Kate just said, it is very complex. It can combine all kinds of things. It integrates different ways of looking at, of understanding human perception. What you just saw was eye tracking. And what's really interesting too is to see the big companies like Honda, BMW, GM, you know, they will use this software to really understand if things that they're presenting to the client are giving the reactions they want them to. It's quite amazing how you can now aggregate all this data with eye tracking to understand the human experience better. It's one of the themes of the class I teach is that what it really brings to the fore is this famous quote from Sigmund Freud, who he never got to use biometrics, unfortunately, but he did interview hundreds of people, and he had this quote, "The mind is like an iceberg, it floats with 1/7 of its bulk above water." So now with Imotions, what people can do is understand how the subliminal brain, the unconscious, is driving conscious behavior. And that's why, you know, the big companies are all using this software. They want to drive consumer behavior, and they can do it with Imotions quite well. It's fascinating too to really study it. And what you're seeing too, there's more of this understanding about the importance of unconscious in design. 95% of our brain activity is beyond our conscious awareness. That's a clip I took from a website designing website. And, you know, this idea that the tech people really know that you're designing first for the unconscious brain. And the big concept of that is really well articulated in a famous book by a Nobel Prize winner, Eric Kandel, a professor emeritus of neuroscience at Columbia. All of our conscious thoughts and actions are unconscious first. So when you understand how the unconscious is working, then you can really understand what conscious behavior and experience will be. Game-changing stuff, the 21st century paradigm shift, indeed, completely. And then what you're seeing too, what I'm seeing too, is a lot more interest in emotions in a lot of fields, and really understanding how people work. This magazine here was on a supermarket shelf, you know, a couple months ago. The Science of Emotions. You can now pick up that magazine as you head out the checkout. And then there's this famous quote from Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. She's a former neuroscientist at Harvard who has a TED Talk about her insights into brain science after having a stroke. Her TED Talk's been viewed 25 million times, and she shows, although many of us think of ourselves as thinking creatures that feel, biologically we're feeling creatures that think. And so with Imotions too, you start understanding, you know, how feelings arise and how quickly they can actually be recorded with some of this new technology. What's interesting to me too is how business schools like Harvard Business School in 2018, they published a series on emotional intelligence. Who knew? And basically some of this science, you know, about how if you're going to be a successful businessman, you need to know about hormones. You need to know about authentic leadership. There's a book I just got in this series called Leadership Presence. It talks about the way you stand, the way you sit in your chair will determine how people actually hear what you're saying. I mean, it's really amazing. And they get into the hormones, and it's quite fascinating that now in business school, they're studying neuroscience, they're studying biology of perception. So it's part of the 21st century paradigm shift, the new age of biology. So the big question for me as a licensed architect who was not required to take any biology to get a license in the United States, how does it change architecture and how we see ourselves? And what was amazing, working with Imotions and Tufts, we were able to, with the city of New York, get pictures of a recently renovated New York City public library. And for the first time in history, we could actually look at how do people look at the front door of the library. And we could see how the fixations fall on the library in 15 seconds. And then what we could do, though, we could play with it and we could say, well, what if the architect hadn't put those lovely arched windows? What would happen? And for me as an architect, this was mind-blowing. What you start to see is without conscious awareness or control, your brain does not let you look at the building the same way. It's absolutely, it's like, what? This is amazing. That you're a sense of where to go in the building, the sense of, you know, how welcoming the building is really set, the foundation is set by the pre-attentive or the subliminal behaviors. That's the pre-attentive usually refers to the first 3 to 5 seconds when you look at something. Oh, and now here's a question. I've asked people, where would you rather wait? The library on the left, on the library on the right? I've asked over 1,000 people this question. Where do you think they want to wait, Kate?
I'm gonna say probably the right.
That's exactly right. Isn't that amazing? So they want to wait at the library on the right, even though the other building's just the same. They probably won't know why, but with Imotions, you start to get the understanding why. That one reason might be because they can fixate more securely on the building on the right. And what you can see too, this is really fascinating, how the time to first fixation on the left is less than a second when it doesn't have windows. But by 12 seconds, 12 of the 30 people are already looking beyond the building. They're already looking outside the building. Whereas when they're already ready to go past it. Whereas when the building has the windows, what happens is it takes a tiny fraction of a second longer to find a door, 1.2 seconds. They'll go to the edge of the building by 10.8, but then they're going to look back at the building. By 13 seconds, they're looking back at the building. That might play into why, when asked which building they want to wait, well, I go park the car, and they wait with the books. Where they want to wait with the building with the windows. They won't know why, but with Imotions, I can deconstruct why that was their response. It's incredibly powerful. And then there's stuff like this you can do. These photos we got from the city of Somerville. It's a new parking garage. And on the right, what we did is a friend added some beautiful Matisse-like art. And what was amazing here, this is a quick pilot study we did, but this blew our mind, that when you have the Matisse-like art, the brain does not let you look down the street. You can really see the difference. What happens when you have a beautiful art to look at, the brain makes you focus on the art, and your brain doesn't let you look down the street as much. And what gets more fascinating too, because Imotions is multimodal, you can then combine it with facial expression analysis software. That's very powerful software that measures how the facial expressions change as you take things in. And what you see here is, this was a pilot study, we only had 10 people look at it, only 5 smiled, but look at the difference here. You can actually tell how many times people will smile. How many more times they smiled with your architectural intervention or with the mural. It's really amazing. And actually, that's not random either, because when people smile, they're happier, it releases oxytocin, they'll be less stressed, they'll be healthier. Too much stress really impacts longevity. So you could actually make the case that kids walking by this building for school will be healthier when it has this mural on it than if it didn't. So that's the incredible thing. You can start to really get down to the details as an architect about how your interventions change how the building will function. You can learn people ignore blank facades all the time, everywhere worldwide. You can understand before something's built, how a building will make people feel implicitly. And you can understand how specific elements impact the overall design. The other really important thing, this is something from neuroscience to take in, you can determine if it's approachable or avoidant. Will people subliminally want to walk toward it and linger, or will they not? That's a huge thing, because that really determines whether you're designing something healthy in the public realm or not. So for instance, like this Queens Library, this we got from the city of New York. What's interesting is this public facility, probably built about 10 years ago, designed for the public. Where do you think people will look? This was fascinating to us when we did this. What we learned is that even though it does have the reflections that might get their eye, that's not what got their eye. What got their eye was the sexy girl in the yoga pose. And what got their eye were the people and any panel showing a person. And then there was the contrasting bus that got their eye, the contrast of the dark and the very white bus. And then you can get even more detailed and show this to a traffic engineer. It's really fascinating. People didn't see the red light until 14 seconds. There's just too many other people in the scene. It's really, really interesting. And then this is a famous one too. This is, Copley Place, very famous place in Boston, Trinity Church, Hancock Tower. Now it's called 200 Clarendon. It changed hands about 10 years ago. And the new owners decided to draw attention to the building, to help with renting it. and they hired a French artist to do an installation. You can see it at the top of a guy floating on a barge in a river in France, totally wild. Then we eye tracked, and what we learned, and this became the cover of Planning magazine, is people did look at Trinity Church first, but where they really focused without conscious awareness or control was the guy, even though you only see him in outline. That was really interesting, and that was actually, you can really see that was so smart of the owners of the new skyscraper, of the new owners of the skyscraper to do it, because that side faces the highway going into Boston. So without conscious awareness, all the drivers would start thinking of the Hancock Tower. Pretty amazing stuff. So what you learn really, really quickly when you do any biometric analysis, people are built to look at people. We are a social species. And I do show my students slides like this. And then I'll ask them to draw the images they saw. And what's fascinating is nobody can ever remember or even read the text, but everybody almost always sees the face. And in this image, the building that most stands out is the Customs House Tower that kind of suggests a person, like it's wearing a hat. And in this image, what stands out is they'll usually see the women. You know, I think it takes 50,000 times longer for the brain to process text than an image. So now you understand the design strategy of all Apple ads. Apple ads in general have maybe 12 fonts in them, maximum 12, 14, but they'll have usually images of people because Apple wants to get your attention. So what you see pretty quickly is what the brain prioritizes. This is a very famous painting by Giuseppe Arcimboldo, a Renaissance painter. His paintings are in the Louvre. You can instantly see the face here, but you can't instantly see the face here. And the reason is because of the neurobiology of face perception. The human brain devotes more area to face recognition than the recognition of any other visual object. And basically, this is what Kandel says, the brain reconstructs reality according to its own biological rules. You have a figural primitive of the right side up face in your brain that's functioning by the time of the third trimester for the fetus. So a third trimester of the fetus, they have projected images through the uterine wall, and the fetus can recognize the upright over the upside down face because that template is in your brain. Your brain's not a blank slate at all. So that's why it's easier to see this versus it's harder to see this. This is called template-based processing. It takes fractions of a second longer than to process this. It's really fascinating to understand nature's preset, what she wants us to see, okay? And the big businesses know this, and they actually track it. Amazon tracks what people click on, and the number one thing that people click on is the human face on a book cover. The number two thing is a pet face. Barack Obama's, Hillary Clinton's books, they usually have their faces on them. There's a reason for that. You'll sell more. And then when I did my first copy, the first edition of my book, I did have them put faces on it. Then we eye tracked it. I showed that without conscious awareness, it shows without conscious awareness, people go right to the face. So for the second edition, I showed this to the publisher, and we kept the same faces on them. There's the Amazon logo, which suggests a face. Okay. And then what's fascinating too is businesses do seem to know this, because it doesn't matter what you're selling. You can be selling LG, which is electronics, or Quaker, which is oatmeal, or or Gerber, which is baby food. What they know is that human perception is relational. We're hardwired to see upright faces. So that's why all the logos suggest upright faces. It's pretty interesting how the business community knows this, but the general public does not. Oh, and then this is fascinating. Often in my lectures, I ask people to draw a house as if they're 5, or to remember what it was like when they were a 5-year-old and they drew a house. And then I asked them, in 2018, I asked them to tell me where they grew up or what country they were from. And it was amazing, whether they're from Turkey, India, Italy, Serbia, China, Zambia, Russia, Spain, they all draw the same thing. Effectively, it's a house. Again, it's exactly as Freud said, it's the subliminal brain directing us what we need to see. And again, car companies study this and know this. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal in about 2008 about how cars got angrier. And often people tell me now, and I show them this science about how, yeah, they think a lot of the cars are getting scarier looking. And computer scientists follow this as well. This is a picture from a German, and he sent me this picture because it was in his article in the Journal of Computer Information Systems. The perception of faces is more critical than previously thought for how humans perceive the aesthetics of the environment, the architecture of house facades, and the buildings they're surrounded by in their day-to-day lives. So basically, computer scientists need to know this. They're building robots. Robots have to be able to predict our behavior, and so they need to know how we're going to behave around face-like facades differently than non-face-like facades. And so when this science that you start to really be able to be revealed really definitively with Imotions, it reframes architectural history in a way. Because suddenly I understood, well, no wonder famous medieval churches like this one in Salamanca, Spain, it's a World Heritage Site, no wonder they'd have the 12 apostles. It makes perfect sense, right? People were mostly illiterate, only the clergy could read. The church was very powerful politically. They wanted people to feel welcome and like they were coming into their home when they went into the church. Without conscious awareness, people will look up at the apostles and move towards them. It makes perfect sense. It kind of reframes how you even talk about what we see in architectural history because you understand it differently. You understand why a primate that's face obsessed would put faces on buildings in new ways now. And then, oh, and this is, what is this? This is just 400 years later, an Apple store, the 12 apostles of Apple. This is like, I think in 2015, what does Apple do? You can barely see the text. What do you see? The smiling face is looking at you. A face looking at you releases oxytocin, makes you, a hugging hormone makes you more likely to walk more deeply into the store subliminally. The face is driving you in, much as the faces drove you to the entry of this medieval church. Oh, and this is an Apple Store 2018, Boylston Street in Boston, exact same. So Steve Jobs kind of got this. He had this famous quote, the broader one's understanding of the human experience, the better design we will have. Well, what Steve isn't saying there, he's talking about the subliminal experience. And that's what's really driving the design of the interior of all Apple stores. Apple, as you may know, hires PhD neuroscientists, and they're involved in all aspects of store design and all aspects of what the company does. So why do you think our brain unconsciously prioritizes people and reading faces all the time without our conscious awareness? Why are we so face adept? Any answers here?
I mean, it's the human condition, maybe?
What did you say, Kate?
Maybe it's the human condition.
It's the human condition, yeah, it's survival. So basically, we evolved in the savannah, and what they now say is the human brain and body are still 40,000 years old. You can be 20 years old, but you've got a 40,000-year-old mechanism running your nervous system. And our ancestors that didn't immediately respond to faces, they all died. So we're still designed for immediately looking at, without conscious awareness, to see if there are faces anywhere. The uncomfortable truth, humans are not modern, but Stone Age. We remain Pleistocene. And this is a quote actually from an article that was in the Harvard Business Review, another Harvard Business School publication. You can take the person out of the Stone Age, but you can't take the Stone Age out of the person, by Nigel Nicholson. It's a great article. I suggest you Google it. You know, that's the idea, that you're designing for a nervous system that remains Stone Age, hardwired for the savannah. Okay. And that's the fascinating thing as an architect. Once you really start to see that with Imotions, and then you start to see something else. The traditional architecture expresses externally our hidden internal brain design. It expresses how we need to be seen to be at our best and how mammals co-regulate. It's not arbitrary. It's an external expression of nervous system requirements to soothe us and calm us down. There's more and more science about this. The Polyvagal Institute by the psychologist Stephen Porges is now online, and it explains the fantastic science that really got developed in the 1990s about how face-to-face interactions regulate state. This is a slide I stole from Stephen's PowerPoint talks. So our need for faces runs our life and our nervous system without our conscious awareness. Perception's relational. I mean, obviously the people running the business schools somehow get that, and also the people running companies get that. That's why, as I mentioned, all of corporate logos tend to be faces. Right? So what happens if a building or streetscape doesn't have a face or have eyes or relationship? So this is a famous building in Harvard Square, the Lampoon Building. Tourists from all over the world come and take a selfie with this building. But what happens if a building is built like many modern buildings with no face? Well, what happens is it'll get a face. So this is famous Bilbao. It opened in 1997 by Frank Gehry, very famous, renowned architect, still working in his 90s. But before the museum opened, the directors insisted that Jeff Koons' puppy be put in front of the front door. It's a face. That's where people stop. That's where it tells people where the entry is. And recently, I heard a group from MIT recently visited there. Where did they take their photo? Around the puppy. Human perception is relational. We need to see faces. And often in modern architecture, what happens is you'll get a big sculpture of a face, or a small sculpture of a face, or a poster of a face on the building because people otherwise won't look at it. Okay. And then that's the final question that I couldn't understand. How did modern architecture happen? Why did buildings become blank and faceless and not there? How did that happen? And I couldn't understand the difference. I lived in Europe for 5 years in my 20s, and the difference between old Europe and modern Europe was really striking. Why was it so easy for me to be in traditional Europe? What was going on? And and when you do a quick heat map, you can see the traditional building. This is a building in Cambridge. The one on the right is a building built by the city of New York, a library. You can see pretty quickly with a heat map that the traditional building gets you subliminally. The new library, people are going to look more at the edge of the building, the book drop, and then the fire hydrant. They're not going to look at the building at all. So what's going on? So to answer that question, I do this slide with my class. And so they're architecture students, so they should know who were the fathers of modern architecture. Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier. Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius were both German. They're both born around the same year. They die around the same year. Le Corbusier is French-Swiss. And these are their iconic buildings, which got really popularized, particularly after World War II, and are everywhere worldwide now. So what happened to them? What happened to them is when they were in their late 20s, early 30s, you have the catastrophe of World War I. And that's something that we celebrated the centenary of World War I in 2018. The American PBS, a documentary, put out a movies called The Great War, and they said the impact of World War I is contemporary. I think in our world today, we're seeing that. And it was a war that 20 million deaths, 20 million casualties, and it led to World War II 20 years later. And these are, I'm just going to show you briefly this painting because it was made by an American. He was 62 years old, a famous painter, John Singer Sargent from Boston, who was sent by the British Army to portray Americans and Brits fighting together. And then in honor of the centenary, the painting was sent around the country, and I saw it. World War I, gas attack. World War I, first tanks. And the impact of World War I is also getting studied now in terms of really trying to understand its casualties and to understand how many soldiers suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which wouldn't be diagnosed really, wouldn't really enter the medical dictionaries till the end of the 20th century, 1980. And then in 1994, you could start doing magnetic resonance imaging, studies like this, which show how the brain shrinks when it's been through mass stress of war. Okay. And so now we have all these terms and these studies for what trauma does to the brain. There are trauma institutes in Boston because we realize that PTSD is more endemic than people ever understood before. During trauma, your body responds by going into fight or flight. It causes your brain to get stuck in danger mode without you even realizing it. Again, it's the subliminal brain, just like Freud says. And PTSD fragments your relationships with yourself and others. This is a book, the major book on PTSD. Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. And he writes a lot about how reality is a construct between your eye and brain. And not only the way we live, but specifically the way we choose to build our buildings reflects hidden internal brain design that we may not know we carry it unconsciously or always responding to. This is something I discuss in my book, Urban Experience Design, and then the more recently Cognitive Architecture second edition. That you can suddenly see that, oh my gosh, PTSD gave us modern architecture. So Walter Gropius, who taught at Harvard from 1930s to 1950s, in the architecture department, you can see Gropius's PTSD is in his architecture. Harvard wanted Gropius to live in Cambridge. He said no. He preferred a remote apple orchard in the town of Lincoln, about 15 miles away. And this is the house he built in the 1930s, and next to it is a bunker along the World War I trench. It now has trees around it. It's now a preserved site, and the bodies of World War I soldiers are still around the building. What you can see is that when you have PTSD, you see the world differently without knowing it. You become disembodied as you're building. So Gropius's house, the Harvard instructor who brought modern architecture to America, his house is on the right. The house across the street is on the left. One house you immediately front the door, the other you don't quite know where the front door is. You immediately find the front door, the other you don't know where it is. And the neighbors were quite upset actually when he built the house. He couldn't understand why. With PTSD, because you lose brain volume, you lose the ability to process detail. I could never understand why modern architecture became so blank. One reason is because the people who came up with it couldn't process it. 50% of the brain's cortical energy is spent processing visual stimuli. When you lose brain neurons, you can't process as much visual stimuli, so you want things blank. Okay. What's mind-blowing about this, though, is when you go into the Gropius's house, you see that he recreated the trench in his office. The office is on the left. It's now part of a historic site. You can go visit it. And the right is a World War I trench where you can't see out unless you stand up. So with PTSD, you keep recreating the traumatic experience in an effort to heal from it. And then this is what really blew my mind. His bedroom is laid out like a dugout. That's the trench sleeping quarters where men slept along a corridor, but going through a doorway. So in his house in Lincoln, Massachusetts, he actually creates a corridor in the bedroom and then a doorway, and then through it is just where the bed is. He's recreating. Okay. Interior wall construction has the randomness of trench construction. When someone's about to kill you, or subliminally, if you think you're about to die, you're going to start doing really random behaviors. So vertical boards might be put up horizontally. On the right is actually a reconstructed World War trench in Hanover, Massachusetts, the American Heritage Foundation. If you're in Massachusetts, you should definitely go see it. It's amazing. This is a poster I was invited to present at a health conference, a medical conference. Modern architecture is a direct expression of the trauma of the World War I trench. I presented that at the 30th Annual International Trauma Conference in Boston in 2019. And then what I thought I should do, because I'm not a doctor and I'm not a psychologist, is to show these slides to people who are. And this is what they said. If you never told me you lived here, I could tell this person had been traumatized. It's a house built for safety. It's classic PTSD. Every trauma expert we contacted reiterated this view without hesitation. With the house parallels you show, it's obvious that Jim Hopper, a trauma psychologist and teaching associate at Harvard Medical School. In looking at Gropius's house, it's a direct expression of how trauma works. Andy Dukas, a clinical psychologist at the World Trade Center Health Clinic at NYU School of Medicine. Okay, so in a way, their responses, they were so emphatic. It was PTSD. It almost gave me PTSD. It was like, oh my God, what's going on here? But yeah, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Neutra, famous modern architects have all been retrospectively diagnosed now with PTSD. And then PTSD really wasn't known until the end of the 20th century. We didn't talk about it and understand how endemic it can be until really the 21st century. What about Le Corbusier? He's really famous. He had incredible power in architecture worldwide. These are some of his buildings, and they've been copied all over the world. But now, if you read about Le Corbusier, he was actually had too poor vision to serve in World War I in the Swiss Army. But what he's now been diagnosed as having autism spectrum disorder. And that's quite interesting. That's called by Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen an overly male brain, where people come up with systems very easily, but they tend not to think about other people's emotional or preferences or experience. So Le Corbusier came up with his famous 5 points of new architecture without ever asking anyone. He didn't do any preference studies. He didn't say, would you like to live here or would you like to live in a house in Venice? He didn't do that. He just came up with it kind of in a very kind of systematic way. And what's fascinating though with Imotions is it's just mind blowing. This is eye tracking I did. The person on the right has autism spectrum disorder. The person on the left does not. Without conscious awareness or control, what you see immediately is that the autism spectrum person will avoid looking at eyes. Okay, so his Corbusier architectural prescriptions, having ribbon windows, really reflect his inability as someone on the autism spectrum to easily look at face-like facades. There's a lot of this on the web now, by the way, guys. This I got from the web, how autistic brains see the world differently. So a neurotypical person will, without conscious awareness control, immediately look for the eyes of the elephant and the baby elephant. The person with ASD, autism spectrum disorder, will do the opposite. Okay, and this was fascinating too. Again, with this blew my mind. 30 people on the left, their brain made them focus on the detail in the door. The person on the autism spectrum, look where he looks. He can look directly at the blank facade. And then when you look at Corbusier's architecture, this is his famous National Museum of Western Art in Tokyo, 1957. You can see this is why he built that way. Someone who looks at the world like that will build that. Get it? Whereas a blank facade is very confusing for the neurotypical public. Okay. So how did modern architecture happen? Relationally compromised people with atypical fixations, mostly PTSD, came up with the architectural, abetted by a wounded world rushing to bury the past after World War I, even more so after World War II, and an economic power structure willing to profit from it. I really go into this in more depth in Cognitive Architecture, 2nd edition, which has more than 24 images, some of the images I just showed you from Imotions in full color, the first book to eye-track architecture in full color in it. So impact of World War I, not to go on and on about World War I, its trauma gave us modern architecture. Architecture becomes avoidant. It's an external expression of atypical internal brain structure, all right? So the 21st century paradigm shift, which the OECD has correctly, I think, revealed, helps us see what we're built to see and need to see as a social species. So you can really see here why these are all greater Boston buildings, most of them under historic district. You can't take them down or change their facade. Why they give a sense of identity to the greater Boston area. Okay. 21st century paradigm shifts helps understand how evolution made us face-centric, and what secured our survival in the wild shows up in traditional building elevations. For good reason, to feel at our best, to be able to be social, we need to subliminally attach, all right? Impact of war is dissociation. Impact of modern architecture is a dissociated public realm, all right? Great quotes that I can't get enough of. The past is never dead, it's not even past. That's true of our evolutionary biology. That's also true of our history. The impact of World War I is contemporary. We're living that really today. Okay, these are learning objectives when I present to architects that I have to do. You want to understand the importance of human unconscious processing when you're building architecture. You need to know that biometric model, including eye tracking, also facial expression analysis, can be used to determine before a building's built how it's going to be perceived. You need to demonstrate, it's very good to understand the extent the human brain is space-oriented. And to understand with Imotions, you really understand, you start to see that reality is a construct between eye and the brain. You can learn more about this at the book Cognitive Architecture, as well as our nonprofit. We did found that to get some of this out. Contact us at contact@thehappy.org. This is more of a preliminary study with Imotions we did showing how the brain's, this is amazing. In under 5 seconds, without conscious awareness, finds the front door of the old building, it can't find the front door of the new one. This is a really important idea, a book I recently read. When you know the mechanism, you can use that understanding in countless ways to drastically improve the human condition. That is how you spark a revolution. You shift the frame, you change the lens, and all at once, the world is revealed and nothing is the same. That's Imotions' impact in architecture. Thank you.
Wow, Anne, I just got goosebumps. I'm not even joking. That was amazing, especially the endings.
Yeah, this quote is great, huh? It's really great. Yeah. She's a doctor who writes about child development and trauma, but it's really, it's good.
Oh, amazing. I'm just going to take presentation rights back just for a second because we are getting right into questions. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get to all of your questions. So let's do that now as we actually give you all a chance to answer a quick audience poll, because we would love to know how we can follow up with you. And if you have questions for Anne, if you want to talk more about Imotions and how all of this came together, we can definitely reach out to you. So I'm just going to launch a quick poll here, and you can just fill in the questions. My camera and Anne's camera might have gone off now, just don't be alarmed, but you should be able to see this little pop-up where you can answer the poll. And while you do that, I am going to queue up the first set of questions, Anne, because we have a ton. So if you would like to ask a question, please put this into the chat right now so that we can make sure we can get to all of yours. So they're all coming in hard and fast right now. So I want to start, Anne, by asking you a question from Elizabeth Wallace. So she was asking about the segment you showed about one of the first buildings you showed with the statues, one of the very old famous buildings.
Palladio.
Yeah, exactly. Did you try showing the same building without the statues by photoshopping them out? And if
no,
so,
that's a really good question. What we ended up doing was photoshopping out the windows.
okay.
But yeah, basically there's this famous quote, out of sight, out of mind. Right, and you really realize Imotions shows you that. That'd be definitely a follow-up study to Photoshop out the statues would be great. But I think I've done enough Imotion studies to know that without conscious awareness, people just always look for people. And the study should be done, but my prediction would be you can't look at the building when it doesn't have that many statues on it. And I think Palladio, or I think Palladio, whoever ended up actually putting the building together, because I think he died before the building was actually finished, knew how statues draw people in.
Mm-hmm. Yes, great.
But it definitely would be a great follow-up study.
Yeah, I mean, here's your idea for your next project. Okay, great. I'm just going to give people a chance to answer the last bit of the poll, but let's move on to the next question, which was, how large was the group of respondents in, like, on average, how many people did you track in eye tracking per study that you?
Well, basically, Imotions will help set it up, but I think at the time it was 30 to 39.
Mm-hmm.
And then I showed some pilots where I just didn't have a lot of time, and I even showed, I just did 10. But it depends on what Imotions platform you're using, but you can do 30 to 39. And there also, you can also do mobile eye tracking. There's all kinds of things you can do. But when I did lab eye tracking, we did like 30, 39, 35. And it's really, really fascinating.
Yes. Yeah, and we actually, at Imotions, we recommend that you collect on average, like Anne said, about 30 at least. The thing with Imotions is that it's actually such qualitative and quantitative data that you don't need a tons of respondents if you're using our desktop platform, which has very, especially if you're using eye tracking, has highly accurate and precise eye tracking metrics. If you're using our online product, Imotions Online, then we recommend that you overly recruit, because eye tracking with webcam-based eye tracking, like a webcam that you have on your computer, is inherently not as accurate. So we would say try to oversample up to 5 times what you actually want to yield to make sure that you're collecting the data that's valid. So yes, just a little tidbit there. I'm going to close this poll. Thank you so much for answering. And I'm going to turn off my sharing screens just so we can talk, so you can just see our faces. And great. So we have a question from Roberto, who asks, are organic forms preferred over symmetrical shapes in architecture? Now, do you have any thoughts about that, Anne?
Well, that's really interesting. So there definitely is a biophilic thing. We love organic things. We love looking at fractals. You can definitely see that. But there's also a symmetry bias in the brain too. So the face tends to be symmetrical. And in architecture, there's a symmetry bias that I think people have an easier time looking at a symmetrical building than an asymmetrical. Obviously, there could be that's kind of crazy to say that, but there is. Yeah, the thing that you really see with Imotions instantly is people hate blank facades, and people cannot focus on glass facades at all. Glass is very, very confusing for people to look at when it's on the street. And that was the thing that struck us. Even if it's a giant behemoth building, your brain does not want you to look at it, doesn't know where to look. Whereas a brick building, a traditional brick building with the detail has the requisite fixation points. Actually, this blank thing is actually fascinating because it also applies to sidewalks and road design. So it's an old streets in Paris and some old streets in Boston, they'll have lovely, brick patterns. That's actually easier for people to look at and walk down than just blank concrete or blank asphalt. It's really interesting. If you want to encourage walkability, you need to have patterned walkways.
That's super interesting. That actually relates to the next question that folks are asking about. There's a couple people asking about like difference between running a study on a screen compared to running a study looking at a building in 3D. Like if you're actually in person, I'm doing your eye tracking, in that, like on that street. And so Santiago is asking, is it possible to do eye tracking in movement? Which it is. And Anne, I know that you've done some studies with eye tracking glasses. Do you want to quickly talk about what you've done?
Yeah, we did do one. It's in our newest book, Programming for Health and Wellbeing by Routledge. We have a chapter on using mobile eye tracking and galvanic skin response, and that's really fascinating. I think it's very revealing. I mean, I think the issue with running these things, like a fire truck goes by, that'll distort your results. If their siren goes off, that can distort your results. But what you also see with those eye tracking, mobile eye tracking, what was amazing, one of the problems is people weren't looking at buildings as much. They were looking, because of the way we walk, the head it goes down 10 to 15 degrees. So a lot of what you're seeing is the sidewalk, or people will be looking at people, or people will look at an advertisement, or people look at a face inside a cafe through the window. That's what we found, is that it was hard to, we really wanted to really get the impact of the building. And we found that mobile eye tracking is still useful, but there are just other things you have to take into account. So the thing about a lab setup, it's good to have both, actually. It's good to have both, because the thing about a lab setup is you can kind of control exactly what you want to look at. I want to look at when I change the color of the door red. I think an Imotions neuroscientist, someone told me, when you're looking at human behavior, it's like drinking out of a fire hose. So much is coming at you. That's the issue. So you have to be able to reduce things, parse things down, so you can really get what's going on. But I would definitely recommend both. When you use Imotions, it's like when you use a microscope. You suddenly see the world completely differently. Completely different. It's a new lens. It's a new lens.
Yeah. It really warps your perception or your preconceived notions.
It blows away any preconceived notions, and you realize that consciousness matters, but it's actually maybe not quite as important as you thought it was.
Yeah. Then we have a question from Liliana, who's wondering also about including this in your studies, the impact of natural light in interior spaces. Have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, some of my students have looked at that, and that's actually a huge thing, having good natural light. Also having operable windows, I would argue. But yeah, I think lighting is a huge thing, and lighting determines how people look at things. So that is, again, a huge thing to study. Natural light, that's not the area I really wanted to focus on, again, because it is like drinking out of a fire hose. I decided I was going to focus on blank versus non-blank facades, what happens to the body. And then I realized, oh my God, that's huge, because the face like facade thing is just really, really huge. There's a term called neuroception, developed by Stephen Porges, PhD. And neuroception is this idea that without conscious awareness or control, your body is always looking for feelings of safety or danger. And when you see that face like facade, there are many other variables, but immediately soothe you. If it's blank, it shuts your nervous system down.
Right. Yeah. Actually, on that topic, we have a question from Maria from Spain, who asks what the role is of vegetation in front of facades in relation to that visual attention. We talked about the Jeff Koons puppy planted sculpture, but what other things may?
Yeah, I think vegetation is also, look, the human brain is hardwired to look for fractals. We love looking at vegetation. That can really make a difference. I mean, and planting trees and on streets can make a difference, but architecture really does matter too, and whether or not it has the detail you can fixate on. So traditional brick architecture, just like the old brick sidewalks, which can be bumpy, but still are easier for us to look at and walk down. So vegetation matters, but I'm not sure how much, I think about Walt Disney designing Disney World in the 1950s, right? And there's not that much vegetation in it, but what it does have is Disneyland Main Street has 52 different ornate building elevations, each face-like. Because what his Imagineers did is they studied places like Tivoli Gardens and in Europe where people are happiest, and they noticed people need to see detail in buildings to be able to regulate. So plants matter, but I would argue that putting plants in front of a modern building is kind of a Band-Aid. A traditional building would make people feel happier on the street.
Interesting. Yeah. Actually, Elizabeth Wallace mentions that She lives in a town. I live in the border of DC and Maryland. The Maryland side has Victorian Cape Cod and bungalows. Across the street, they're building a PTSD type monolithic modern square building where you can't see the entrance. As the community organizer, would protesting to ask for a fix, perhaps like a cat-like statue in front, would that make it more friendly? It's taking up a lot of the green space.
Yeah. That it's really sad. I mean, again, architects don't study biology, so they don't understand they're building really stressful places. And not only that, it's going to destroy the coherence of the place.
Right.
But I think it's important the city designers, the community groups permitting this kind of architecture. I think you need to bring them into this science, because well-being matters, and you're not just designing for the next generation. This generation, you're designing for the next one. We want to design things sustainably that people will care about in the future.
Right.
If you can't look at a building, you're not going to care about it.
Yes. On that note, we're running quickly out of time, so I'm going to ask the last two questions, and then if you don't have, if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, please feel free to write to us. We will try to follow up with all of the ones that we didn't get to over email as well today, and we'll connect anyone with Anne who would like to be connected. But let's answer the last two questions. So Juan asks, do you think that the purchase motivation of a project, I'm guessing that you mean an architecture project, could be affected based on how clean or decorated the facades are or the interiors are? Like, do you think that the decision makers, the investors, would unconsciously, non-consciously look at a sort of facade and think, yes, this is something I want to invest in based on how decorated it is?
Yeah, well, I think it definitely can. Where I really see it played out is when you look at tourist magazines or places they want you to go visit Amsterdam. What do they show? They show traditional canal buildings in Amsterdam that are just beautiful to look at, that have been there 300 years. They don't show the modern Amsterdam ever. Or if you go to the Harvard Coop in Boston, you look at the postcards they have of Harvard. No modern buildings. It's the 18th, 19th century brick buildings, the Georgian buildings that look very face-like. That's what's going on, and that matters, because you want to send a postcard. They won't even look at a postcard, and then you want to send a postcard to make someone feel good, right? So you can see how it plays out. Yeah,
you really can. Okay, so the last question is sort of a theoretical one that I would love to end on, and which is, it's so important, this is the question, it's so important to understand how we connect with our buildings and surroundings for mental well-being. What changes do you hope to have happen for the next generation? Like, impact on young people, for example, and what do you think architectural designs can have, or what kind of impact can that happen for the next generation? What's your vision?
Well, I heard a doctor recently say that architects can have more impact on our health than doctors. The way you build the built environment will encourage you to gather, to walk, to get together. So I think what's great about Imotions is you start to tease apart how the architectural experience actually happens. And once you know that, once you know the mechanism, you can really improve human welfare amazingly. And then what's great about Imotions too is it comes up with these heat maps. You suddenly get it exactly what's going on. If you just read like the neuroscience, it's very confusing. When you see the heat map, you suddenly get it. It gives you data in a very visually accessible way where you don't need a PhD to understand it.
Yeah, and we like to say at Imotions too that you can extrapolate these kind of insights across many industries. So we hope that this webinar has given you insight into Anne's work with architecture, and that it's maybe given you inspiration in your field, whether or not you're an architect, to sort of like take a look at eye tracking, take a look at facial expression analysis, take a look at heart rate variability, take a look at brain activity, and to sort of see what the preconceived notions you might have had about your research could be changed using biometric and sensor research. So on that note, I want to say thank you so much, Anne. This has been such a pleasure. And if you still have questions, feel free to email us at marketing@imotions.com, and we'll be sure to connect you to the right people who can answer all of your questions. So thanks so much, Anne. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.